That's right. And what the states are going to have to decide is whether or not they're going to impose restrictions. And if so, how severe are those restrictions going to be? But if you look at the reports, there are dozens of kids that die across the country left in hot cars.
To me, I've never seen anything like this.
Yeah, this really isn't a class by itself. It's becoming a case of patterns making the predator. Exactly the issue. But here's the problem for both prosecutors and defense attorneys. Jails and prisons are not filled with nuns and choir boys. They are filled with criminals. But that's why this case is so interesting, because New Jersey has a terrorist charge that they believe fit. So it's a balance of safety over sensitivity. And, you know, Brian and I usually are in court with he said, she said. This is he said, they said. That's an environment where Delta's going to really value safety over sensitivity. In other words, they don't tolerate discrimination, but they also don't tolerate disruption.
To Wendy's point, still there could be charges down the road. What's the likelihood of that?
Low. Low to nothing. Low to none. But nonetheless, if it's any solace, no investigation is ever closed if new evidence comes to light.
So much.
This hearing was OJ's to lose, and the more he spoke, I think his family and his lawyer were afraid that may have been the direction that it was headed.
Exactly.
Credibility that's permeating the discussion that we're having. I mean, what did the knife look like? What kind of a knife it was?
What happens now, Wendy?
Well, you know exactly right. There's a visceral response that we have to comments like this. Now, viscerally, we know we shouldn't talk like this, but there's a certain segment of society, a large segment of society, that thinks, I want to stay safe, and that's my number one priority
100%.
in this day and age. The proverbial, does he have a pot to... Right?
Exactly. Right. Very good. Touche.
Right. They're just not going to be economically able to survive. And that's heartbreaking for a lot of the residents. Right, so this lawsuit against Apple has, at its core, pun intended, false advertising. But remember, if he does this, if he wins, he's going to spend the first 100 days in office taking his first 100 depositions and then some, because this type of litigation is incredibly complex.
Here to weigh in is Wendy Patrick, a trial attorney and president of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, San Diego chapter. Wendy, great to see you this morning.
It's a scenario where you've got somebody who is a captive audience, and you hope that's only figuratively. Got the distinctive bullet casings, those 9mm bullet. He used the same gun. They all match, and he had the gun on him when he was apprehended. Here's the law. No body, no problem. But in a case like this, where there were a lot of circumstances that might make it look like an accident, motive matters. And I began my career as a public defender, so I share your experiences there. But I got to tell you, I've also prosecuted prison crimes against inmates. Is the world going to get to watch this unfold in real time?
Wendy, I think you've got a job for the next decade commentating on this trial.
Donald Trump is a man about whom everyone has an opinion, but did it in this case. If it had, perhaps we wouldn't have had the divergent stories at the beginning. That's the legal argument that's in play during this trial. In other words, do the Benghazi emails come first? Are those going to come out next month?
Those were deleted.
Oh, that's funny.
That's exactly right. I think there's like 300 that are...
And that's the counter argument. Richard says, oh, it's a slippery slope. Because remember that memories, unlike fine wine, do not improve with age. Listen to the standard. More probable than not that he was generally aware of some incidents of wrongdoing. That is so vague. Think of this law not as a complete deprivation, but as a timeout. The things that really breaks your heart about this story, doesn't it? You've got kids killing kids. Now, this is not unprecedented, by the way, to have children as young as 8 being charged with homicide. It's true, it's litigation, but oftentimes litigation leads to legislation. But the Duger clan certainly is not the Brady Bunch, and now we learn they're also not all in the family.
News. Michael Wilds is a former federal prosecutor and professor at the Cardozo School of Law. Wendy Patrick is a prosecuting attorney who has prosecuted dozens of hate crimes. Wendy, what do you make of this investigation so far?
Well, these text messages are very interesting, Sandra. What woman doesn't know where her husband is in the middle of the night? The question is this ignorance in the moment, or does it reflect a greater ignorance of his activities? We know now this man was a triple threat. He was radicalized, armed, and angry. Whether the anger stemmed from identity or ideology, this trio of risk factors was something that we would expect that she would have known about. And that's while he is feeling fatigued. I can imagine what this guy is like when he has a lot of energy. But under the facts and circumstances, as hard as it is to believe and as strange as it sounds, she won't be facing criminal prosecution. In a CSI world of forensic evidence, it's hard to go missing without a trace. Premeditation can be formed in a very small period of time. Companies have a level of corporate social responsibility. Emotions are high. It's a horrible crime. Everybody's angry. Now, it's true the ballistics support the fact that it ricocheted, but that doesn't necessarily absolve the defendant from liability from a murder charge. But when it comes to hate crime, that's a bit of a misnomer because prosecutors don't need to prove hate. All they need to prove is that a victim was selected based, and listen to the way it's phrased, on his or her membership, actual or perceived, in a protected category. That can be race, nationality, religion, sexual orientation, what have you. Counter-protesters are not a protected group. Hello, everyone. I'm Wendy Patrick. Welcome to the Daily Ledger. Also, the movement to prevent sexual assaults and rape on college campuses. Next on the Daily Ledger, nuclear inspectors strike out. That's true, but emotionally it's got a lot of appeal, this lawsuit.
We'll see what the
I'm
court...
going to join if she wins. Well, circumstantial evidence is just as good as direct evidence, and they have hit this jury with an avalanche of circumstantial evidence. We want to make sure that those strong statements are really followed by strong actions because actions speak louder than words. Well, first of all, man's best friend is not his dog, it's his family. She committed the crime, she's been convicted for it. Do we kill her for it?
Mercedes Colwyn and Wendy Patrick next.
So it really boils down to, in a word, perception. Was this a coordinated attack or a coincidence? It doesn't look like the second attack was a spur-of-the-moment decision. You know, and that's the issue. Is it an ambush or an accident? This is the bad shot defense. I, too, have a mother whom I adore, and I can't believe we're talking about this kind of a case. He uses his hands to emphasize certain of the points that he wants to believe, as while nothing was criminal, they posted it in order to raise public awareness.
What strikes you?
Well, what strikes me about this race on both sides now is the fact that to voters, credibility counts. It's a great question, Susanna. It's state by state. For example, in California, we don't have a statute, but that is of this year because litigation leads to legislation. And the Cosby case led some states to rethink their statute, making it longer. So that's why it's going to be important to see where the crimes happened and when they happened. Right. We know people that sleep with their cell phones, although none of us are going to admit to that. It's always easier to prove civil liability once you have criminal liability.
Right. Well,
they're not just looking at where there's smoke, there's fire. They're trying to find out whether or not there's smoke. And you also remember we are in the season of Lent, which is a season of reflection, of sacrifice, heading up into Easter.
This instance of soft target attacks. I mean, there isn't a big city in our nation that isn't a soft target.
Shark came into existence as a result of his missteps during Perry's halftime performance. You cleared it, you claim it. Shoveling snow is hard work. Take it from me in San Diego.